Hollisa Alewine here again, and we're referring to Pharisee, Friend or Foe, our latest Becky book. And in the previous segment, we did a little introduction to the problem of the Pharisees, how today we see them as hypocrites and mean and selfish and always out to get Yeshua. But maybe there's another side to the story. Maybe we're reading one side of the story, but without the full context. We're missing some really valuable lessons in the dialogues between the Pharisees and Yeshua. And we mentioned that, part of the problem is that as we look at traditions of men, that seems to be a catchphrase. And we always seem to view that as a bad thing. But it's not always viewed as a bad thing, which is something we bring up in Truth, Tradition, or Tear, is that twice Paul the Apostle, as he's writing to the congregations, tells them to keep the Jewish traditions. He says, just as I pass them on to you. And we're thinking, what? No, tradition's bad, tradition's bad. I've always been taught tradition's bad. It's adding to the Word, it's adding to the Torah. But that's why we need that framework that Yeshua left us, so that we can differentiate between what it means to plant the seed of the Torah and to begin to grow good fruit out of it. And some of those might come out in tradition. Most of us have Shabbat traditions, and the world won't stop if we don't, have just this particular cup that we use on Shabbat, but that's our tradition, and we don't consider it adding to the Word. It's how we remember, and that's what the commandment was. You're supposed to guard and remember the Shabbat. And so we might all have different interpretations of what it means to guard and remember. And to some of us, having those special dinner plates, maybe that have been handed down to us, or having a special glass for the Kiddush. Maybe it's important to some people that they make the challah themselves. It depends on you. You'll develop your own traditions. But if we're going to do that, then we can't turn and look at Orthodox Jews and basically put them with the Pharisees, who were all about only the traditions of men, when that's not entirely true. We're going to investigate. We're going to find out what is the truth about the Pharisees. But if this is true, that the Pharisees did emphasize custom and traditions, that they were growing out of the Torah, is there any precedent for that in the Torah itself? Because if we're going to do something, we expect to find that seed. The seed should be planted somewhere in the Torah that says that it's okay to develop a tradition that helps us remember something in the Torah. So if we go to Genesis 32:32, we can read about the wrestling of Jacob with the angel all night long, and how the angel smites him on the thigh, and it says that ever after that, Jacob, who's now been renamed Israel, he's going to walk with a lamp. And if that were just the end of the story, it's the end of the story, but it's not the end of the story. It goes on to explain that to this day, and this is true, it's true to this day, that it'll say Israelites, or the sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob. Nowadays, we would say Jews. They have a custom that they will not eat the meat that's attached there to that sciatic nerve that goes toward the back of an animal that they eat. And Scripture tells us that that's their custom to this day. That in remembrance of this great event of the renaming, where they actually take on this name, this princely name of Israel, that they commemorate it by the very food they eat. And so typically if you go to a kosher butcher, you're probably not going to find the cuts of meat from a cow or from a sheep that are behind the loin. Anything forward. That's why you're going to see a lot of chuck roasts, things that come from the shoulder or the chest area. But not so much in the back, because it's a lot of work to get that sciatic nerve out of there. So right there, the Torah tells you that custom or tradition can grow out of the seed of the Torah. And it's not a bad thing. It's not written there to tell us how foolish those people are for doing that. It's recording it for a specific reason. And it appears to say, okay, this is a valid custom because it helps them remember this biblical event. And I think in that case, that's a good custom. It's a good remembrance, because if every time you go to the grocery store or you go to the butcher and you have to think about that process of what you're selecting, if that's your tradition, are you just trying to remember which part of the cow you can eat? Or does it remind you every single time of the name that you bear, of what it means to struggle as a human being with that which is heavenly and to prevail? That spiritual part of you can prevail over what probably the church would call the flesh, but what we would know would be that lower part of who we are, the soul and the body itself. And that we can strive and we can improve. That's what it means to be human, that we can grow closer to Adonai and take on his nature, that we can be princes with El. And so when we put it in that perspective, then it really sounds more like a privilege. The idea that every time we buy food, at least meat to eat, that we're thinking about our identity as part of Israel. It's all in the way you look at it. You can either look at it and say, oh, that's too many rules and regulations. Why do they bother with that? It's a man-made tradition. And the Torah says, yes, it is. And they're still doing it to this day. So a lot of times, again, that's how you're approaching the thing. How do you think about it? We can take the same situation and we can look at it with two different points of view. For instance, maybe your friend comes in and she starts asking you a bunch of questions. Well, one person might react and be very grateful, like, I'm glad somebody finally asked about my life, and you might talk for the next hour telling her more than she probably wanted to know about what's going on in your life. But you're just connecting with her and you're glad that she's interested in you. Another person might think, well, that's just being nosy. There's two different ways of looking at things, and usually more than two. But Torah tells us that customs can develop. And so simply saying that the Pharisees were all about man-made traditions, that may not hold a lot of water in light of what Genesis 32:32 says. We will grow traditions and ways of remembering and guarding the commandments. In Judaism, that's the way they do it. So a custom or tradition, we can't say it's inherently evil. We have to peel back down there and say, number one, is it connected to a written commandment? Or is, in this case, it's really not even connected to a commandment. It's connected to a story. But it's a vital story. It's a story you need to understand if you identify with Israel. If you say, I am Israel, then how are you going to remember that? How are you going to guard that? Well, if it affects what you eat every day, then you'll remember. It's a good custom. It's growing out of the seed of the Torah. So what we have here a lot of times is a difference in culture. And that's not to say that Jews have a better culture than whatever culture we came from. But it does say that they do have a unique identity over time because they have held very closely to their covenant. And that covenant is the first 5 books of the Bible. So whereas maybe we read the Bible growing up, if you're like a lot of people, your first version of the Bible was a little New Testament and Psalms. So maybe you didn't have the bigger picture. Maybe the beginning of the Bible wasn't emphasized as much as it could have been. And so maybe now you're going back to the beginning and you're trying to learn as much as you can to match it up with what you know of the New Testament. But the Jewish people, they have been responsible for the great scholarship of the Tanakh, of what we would call the Old Testament, but the Torah, the prophets, the writings, because those first 5 books, the Torah itself, it forms the covenant between Adonai and Israel. And that's why we're working so hard now to go back to those first 5 books and say, what's the nature of the covenant? What does my agreement say? And so by its nature, a covenant is going to join 2 parties in agreement. We both have to agree. And so it's not just this legal agreement. When we look at Israel, when we look at the Jewish people, what we see is that it also applies to a people group, and every people group grows a culture all its own. And part of the wonder of our generation is you don't have to work that hard to experience other cultures, especially when it comes to food. You know, you go to the food court, you can get Chinese food, you can get Mexican food, you can get Thai food, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That's a blessing that we have because distances have been bridged, where we can try the better things of other cultures. But basically, for thousands of years, cultures have been pretty isolated from one another. It's been much harder to cross-influence one another. Israel is not just a religious group. It's not just an ethnic group. It's a people group. It's a cultural group. And therefore, because Jews live in communities, then we have to expect, because that community is based on the Torah itself, their culture is going to be so entwined into that covenant that you really cannot separate them. And if you think that this document, this Torah, is the governing document of that community, of that people group, and even of their culture, then think of, what do we have, 613 commandments? They come out of Egypt with 600,000 men, 12 tribes, clans among tribes. Imagine if they received the Torah and they said, we will do and we will hear, but every single one of us will have to figure out on our own how we're going to do each of these things, which is pretty much what we have today. But they realized, and Moses realized, even before the building of the tabernacle, they had to have judges. They couldn't have 600,000 people plus all hearing and doing the commandments in a different way. They would be running, it would become death instead of life when things work like that. So what if they had 600,000 applications of the 10 Commandments, just the 10 Commandments? Multiply that out and try to figure out what's going on in the community. It would be chaos. So to prevent that chaos, judges were appointed. Moses instructed them. He defined what it meant to guard and to remember the Sabbath. And he had to keep clarifying. I believe it's in Beshalach, where he says concerning the manna, he has to come back and say, and this is what God meant, because you're doing it wrong. This is what he meant. So we can receive the instruction and misunderstand or misapply. And even Moses had to go back and clarify. So he says, okay, you're going to have judges within your tribes. They're going to be appointed. They're going to take care of the easier things, the harder things they can bring to me. And what this is building is peacefulness within the camp and fairness in the camp. When you have these person-to-person relationships, that's important because your person-to-person eventually ends up together in corporate worship. And so if we're wanting to do better at corporate worship, he says you got to go back and your people-to-people interactions have got to improve. We have to have some guidelines. And that's what we'll notice. We each have a different interpretation. Or we'll look at someone else and say, I don't see how you're getting that out of that. And they're saying the same thing. I don't know how you're getting that out of that. Well, here's what happens sometimes. When we're confused, and this, it's easy to do. We'll read scripture, and then, like, let's take something easy, the Passover. You've got a Passover in Egypt. And then succeeding that, you have more generalized Passover instructions, evolving into, hey, when eventually you have a temple and a place to observe Passover, this is what you're supposed to do. So look at the span of time that Moses is having to deal with concerning the commandments of Passover. They circumcise before they have their Passover in Egypt, and then they stop for the next 40 years. Before they go into the land, they start again. So can't you imagine if we just took those simple commandments into consideration, how many different interpretations there would have been of how to apply those things? Because to this day, the question that comes up in Bible studies is, well, why weren't they circumcising in the wilderness? And that's not the only question that comes up. Why? Because we're puzzling through these commandments and saying, well, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? Well, as a community, they had Moses. But what did Moses leave in place when he passed on? He left judges in place. And those judges, in our methods of applying the commandments, in terms of the more ritual applications, the Levites were supposed to be very much involved in teaching the people these things and making sure that there was a uniformity. But here's the problem. In the first century, when we're talking about Pharisees, there was not uniformity. The priests and the Levites and the scribes, they were not, their decisions were not unanimous. They had different viewpoints and interpretations of the Torah. And sometimes that can confuse us because we think, well, didn't the Pharisees say it should have been done this way? But we can see in practical terms, it's being done this way. So if they're saying this, then why are they doing it like this? It's because maybe the Pharisees didn't have the control of the temple at that time. It even affected when they could bring the Passover sacrifice because of a dispute over whether you could actually slaughter your animal on Shabbat itself. So you see, they're even disagreeing in the first century. And what tends to happen historically is because there are different ways of looking at something or interpreting something, we pick one. We take our best guess and decide that's the correct one, even though there might be 3 or 4 or more other opinions that are just as valid. And that's pretty much what Jewish literature does. When we're looking at the Mishnah and the Talmud and so forth, they will record all the dissenting opinions and say, these were the other viewpoints as to how this should be. This is what we decided on for the sake of unity. But the problem is, rather than saying, you know what, there are different ways of interpreting this commandment, no matter how good your Hebrew is. And so I can live. If the majority prevails, or if the judge in Moses' day prevails, or if the leadership of my local congregation prevails, then I'm going to be able to live with that because that's how the word is designed, to test my reaction and my attitude, for one thing. But when I just pick one because I think this one's probably better than the others, then what am I doing? If I say this is the correct one, this is the only way to see this, when if it were the only way to see it, there probably wouldn't be all these other opinions about it. We wouldn't be arguing about it. But when we say that's the correct one, what we're really saying is, I think this is the correct one based on my understanding today, based on my experience today, based on my level of scholarship today, based on my level of Hebrew or Greek today. And we're disregarding that maybe we will grow Maybe I don't think the same thing as I did 10 years ago about that particular verse. Maybe I've experienced more, learned more, and think, wow, that was foolish that I thought that. And I'm glad I didn't run around teaching it to people. So we're all going to have those places where we increase in our understanding. But when we say this is the only correct way to look at this, we have to be really careful, especially if making that statement requires us to toss out all the other scriptural evidence that was presented. So again, it's tough territory, but tradition, it helps to solve some of those problems of dissenting opinions. And, really the problem is when we say this is the only correct way of looking at this. It could only be this way. That's why you have more people involved. You have more scholars involved. And that was as we get into the difference between the two houses, you'll see that the house of Hillel, it's a group of Pharisees called the house of Hillel. They weren't afraid to record the opinions of the opposing house. Why? Because you could even learn from the opposing opinion and say, hey, well, they had a good point here. They had a good point here. And they would record it. The opposite was true of the house of Shammai. They disregarded anything that the house of Hillel said, as if their viewpoint were the only one. What were they then doing? They're discarding all this other scripture that the house of Hillel might be using and saying, there's another point of view here. There's another way of seeing this. Because trust me, when you have an actual temple functioning, lots of questions come up in practical application. So we have to be careful about judging tradition because sometimes the question really is irresolvable, and therefore we have to institute a custom or this way of doing things just to keep peace and to keep people continuing to worship. Some things, Messiah is going to have to straighten them out when he returns. And so the basis for that is that they said originally there's that inviolable text of the Torah that was given to Moses. And where a lot of people differ is the next point. And the Jews say that there was an oral law. There were like an instructor's manual that went with this written text that was also given to Moses. There was additional explanation. That's where you'll see a lot of people veer off because, that's Jewish tradition. Okay, let's just go with them for a few seconds here. To that, you have the scholarly clarifications, the Hebrew scholars getting into the text, getting into the grammar of the thing, and then saying, okay, how do we practically apply this? We might have this thing handed down by Moses, but as we know, especially in the United States, technology has created its own questions about the Constitution. So every generation has to work on those problems that might be presented by inventions, technologies, and so forth. What comes from that? Eventually, cultural applications. How do we in our culture do this? And anybody who's ever been to New York City and then been to Birmingham, Alabama knows that there's a difference in culture. How much more people who might live on different continents. And so out of your cultural applications of a commandment, let's say if you're a Jew from Iran, you might eat rice during Pesach. But if you're a Jew from Europe, you won't. It would be considered chametz. What do the rabbis say? You go with the minchag, or the custom, of the culture where you live. You don't go someplace and take that with you. You accommodate where you are. That culture, their interpretation of what chametz is. And then what will grow out of that cultural application? In some cases, your family traditions. Your family traditions will reflect your culture and your way of saying this is what that verse meant, going all the way back to the Torah text. And where do the Jews come up with the fact that Moses received extra instructions that weren't recorded? They're basing it basically on Deuteronomy 12:21, and you can research that if you want, because he's telling Moses, or referring to instructions and commandments that he says he's given to Moses, but we don't find it in the written text. And sometimes that seems to be the case. We're finding that things were practiced that are taken for granted by the writers of Scripture, that we understand them, but we can't go back to the Torah and find those things. We'll find that throughout Scripture. Just like, where does it say that you can't buy or sell on Shabbat? It says you can rest. It says you don't gather manna, but it says nothing about buying and selling. Well, when you get into the prophets take for granted we understand that we shouldn't be buying and selling on Shabbat. A tradition was handed down, it's just not recorded until the prophet mentions it. So, again, tradition doesn't have to be inherently evil. Because if we're condemning tradition, remember, our culture, a lot of times, especially if you're Jewish, it's going to be, your culture is going to be attached to the covenant itself and how you as a people keep those commandments. And I think over time, that's led to a lot of stereotypes about Jews and Judaism. Because to them, the Torah is something lived in a like-minded community. It's the life of the individual within the community as tied to the whole, much more so than the way it is in Western countries today, where individualism is prized over being part of a community. And the Jewish community is just the opposite. And because of this tight community structure, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. So in the next segment, we'll look at that phenomenon of what the difference is between people who identify themselves first as part of their faith community and then only second as an individual. Now it's kind of reversed according to what we're used to.